Happy Sunday, everyone. Hope you're all doing great. Today, we are again talking about polygamy. This is going to be probably the last time for a while I'm going to talk about this, but I think it's important because of a new discovery that upends or unsettles the church's official narrative about how all this came out. We're going to get into that, and we're going to get into this question of Latter-day Concubines, as I titled this musing. Why do I bring up this topic again? I've said in past musings where I've touched on this, like, this isn't my hobby issue. This isn't, ultimately, like, I don't care one way or the other. But as I've sat with this over the months and years now and continued to research and look into it, I think there is something important here that is not just an indifferent shrug of if it goes one way or the other way, no big deal. And I bring this topic again in part because just days ago, it was like a week ago, President Oakes was in Belgium, and he was doing like a regional conference, and he went to a ward or something, and he spoke with a translator, and this kind of went the rounds through LDS social media, where President Oakes says, "We know that we have a heavenly mother or mothers." So that video gets out. Someone had a little recording of the broadcast or whatever. It went all over social media, and everyone's all up in a tizzy again. Oh, look, celestial polygamy. And this is also relevant in part because President Oakes himself is sealed to 2 wives. Same with President Nelson. So even though polygamy is not being practiced, it's still doctrinally part of the church in allowing men to be sealed in a marital context to more than one woman. Now, this issue that President Oakes raised, do we have heavenly mothers? Is there polygamy? Is that a really legitimate thing? As I said, I've come over the months and years to feel that this is a little more significant than just if it went one way or the other, who cares? And this speech came to mind from what is now one of my favorite shows ever, Andor. I'm surprised that the Disney Star Wars universe could have produced something great, but Andor is amazing. Whether you like Star Wars or not, or sci-fi, it's just a good, frankly, anti-government kind of show. It's excellent. As I thought about this topic, this speech from Marva came to mind. If you haven't watched before, this doesn't really have necessarily any spoilers, but this is from her monologue after she's passed away that I thought pertains to this issue, this wound in the church. Take a listen.
We had fairies. But we were sleeping. I've been sleeping. I've been turning away from a truth I wanted not to face. There is a wound that won't heal at the center of the galaxy. There is a darkness reaching like rust into everything around us. We let it grow, and now it's here. It's here, and it's not visiting anymore. It wants to stay.
Now, before I go on, let me add the disclaimer. I am not saying that the church is the empire. I am not saying we are the rebellion. I am not saying any of the other metaphorical whatever you could try and extrapolate from this. I simply thought that portion of the speech was really interesting, that there's a wound that won't heal at the center of the galaxy, a darkness reaching like rust into everything around us. And to some extent, I feel like that is what polygamy is for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, this wound that won't heal at the center of its history. And, because ultimately this is a question of, was Joseph Smith a liar or was Brigham? Was Joseph Smith sleeping around with teenage girls and other men's wives, or was he an honorable man who loved and had sexual relations only with Emma? Right? Did Brigham introduce false doctrines into the church? And if so, what about the keys and the prophetic calling, right? We have Adam God theory. We have the blacks in the priesthood. We have blood atonement, right? So that is an interesting wound at the center of kind of church historical existence. Can one man be eternally married to more than one woman? Is there a heavenly mothers, plural, or are there, right? Does God have more than one wife? These are fundamental, critical questions about our faith, about our doctrine, about church history, about church culture, and all of it, and I mean all of it, rests on section 132 in the Doctrine and Covenants. Why? Well, because Joseph Smith, as I've said in past musings, fought against polygamy all his life. He opposed it. He tried to, and it did push people out of the church who were caught doing it. Again and again, the record during his life shows that he's fighting it. His journal, which was kept by Willard Richards at this point, says that Joseph forbids the plurality of wives and the practice thereof. No man shall have but one wife. This journal, as you may recall, was edited after Joseph's death, and they did a complete 180. They turned it around. Oh, unless the key holder says that we can do it, and completely removed the part about no man shall have but one wife. Like just a total 180 after Joseph's death, when he was no longer allowed to defend himself or around to defend himself. And so section 132 is the purported revelation that Joseph Smith allegedly received, authorizing plural marriages. It's what Brigham used to justify everything. It's what all the saints ever since have pointed to say, oh, look, this is from God. Therefore, polygamy is okay. And our problem, the wound at the center of the church history that we're going to be talking about today, is that section 132 has all kinds of problems. So let's get into a few. Let's start with verse 1 of section 132. Where it says, I, the Lord, justified my servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as also Moses, David, and Solomon, my servants, in engaging in polygamy. So right off the bat, this alleged revelation claims that God justified all of these biblical fathers in engaging in polygamy. Except no biblical evidence exists to support this. Let's look at Abraham, right? The first one mentioned. People think that, oh, he was, polygamous. Well, there was Hagar. Hagar was Sarai's Egyptian handmaid, personal property. She had no legal standing, no covenantal standing as a wife. Sarai gave Hagar to Abram. This is the pre-changing their names, right? So it's Abram. Sarai gives Hagar to Abram explicitly to obtain children by her, as it says in Genesis 16, not to establish a family bond. This was an act of desperation. It wasn't like a divine command or anything like that. The verse even states that Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. Doesn't say that he hearkened to God, doesn't say that God commanded. It said that his wife is like, I want you to father some children with, my personal property. Here you go. So he listens to his wife. He's pressured into doing it. Abram even reaffirms that Hagar is Sarai's property, not his wife, even after becoming pregnant. Genesis 16 again, it says, behold, thy maid is in thy hand, do to her as it pleaseth thee. So she's still treated in this kind of lowly property, slavish context. After Isaac's birth, Hagar and Ishmael were expelled at Sarah's insistence, affirming that, neither she nor her son were part of the family unit, the covenant. So that's not polygamy. That's a different context. There's Keturah. Some people are like, oh, look, Abraham and Keturah were married. Well, in Genesis 23, Sarah is now 127 years old. She dies. And then we go to chapter 25, and Abraham marries Keturah. So this wasn't a simultaneous marriage. This wasn't polygamous. Keturah was not the polygamous wife of Abraham. So there's no polygamy in the section 132 context, and this is a different cultural context with concubines and slaves, as we'll talk about more in a little bit. So let's go to Isaac. So in Genesis 24, this has the detailed story of Isaac and Rebekah's courtship. And by the way, just Isaac and Rebekah. The Bible never mentions another wife, not even a concubine in Isaac's life. And it gives this like in-depth description of Isaac's posterity, right? Saying like, hey, here's the lineage of Isaac. There's nowhere in there that any other wife or child is mentioned. Even in when his death is recorded in Genesis 49, it makes it even more clear, saying that Isaac was buried alongside his wife Rebekah. They're buried together. It's the two of them. There's no mention of another wife, another possible wife, nothing like that. So Isaac, cross him off the list. Let's go to Jacob. Jacob intended to marry only Rachel, so he's deceived by Laban into marrying Leah. He's later pressured into polygamy by the rivalry between these sisters. So his polygamy is not voluntary. It's not even desired. It's not divinely prescribed. It's this like rivalry between sisters in this cultural context when this stuff is being, perceived as okay in a cultural context, not in a religious context. Nowhere in Scripture does it say that Jacob's polygamy is commanded, praised by God, right? It results from deception, not from revelation. And so then you get, the expansion of Jacob's wives, Bilhah, Zilpah. This comes from the sisters' desperation, their deception, their competition, not from God's instruction. So these women were, like Hagar, slaves used as surrogate wombs for birthing children. This isn't like, I have a bunch of wives, we all love and care for one another. Like, no, this isn't polygamy. This is something else. Moses is mentioned in section 132. So his wife Zipporah is the only spouse ever named in the Bible. Their marriage, their children are documented in Exodus. It's stated again in First Chronicles. There's no second wife that's named, no second marriage that's recorded, no other children listed anywhere in Scripture. The only basis to think, oh, maybe Moses was a polygamist comes from Numbers chapter 12, which refers to an Ethiopian woman that Moses married. But this verse never said that she was a second wife. And there's some evidence that this Ethiopian woman is Zipporah. So it's not like we have any kind of record or evidence or anything that Moses was polygamous. And even if he was, we have no record that it was divinely prescribed. Again, because in the cultural context at the time, polygamy and concubinage is an accepted practice. This is more of a slow stain issue of taking on the things of the world than this divine principle from God, right? Well, what about David and Solomon? They're also mentioned in section 132. Let's go to the Book of Mormon. The most correct book that Joseph Smith says, right? Jacob chapter 2 says, "Behold, David and Solomon truly had many wives and concubines, which thing was abominable before me, saith the Lord." Can't have it both ways, right? So now we've got Jacob 2 completely pitted against section 132, and we have to resolve this tension, this conflict. And we know that the Book of Mormon was produced under the direct knowledge and oversight and involvement of Joseph Smith, and section 132, as we'll get into, has a very checkered claim to existence, and it's alleged to have come from Joseph Smith, but very weak, right? And likely not at all the case, especially in the current context as a package of, all these verses together, this was the revelation. So Jacob, again, in the Book of Mormon that the Lord has given us, says that David and Solomon had many wives and concubines, and this thing was abominable before me, saith the Lord. We can take it further. Again, Joseph Smith, when he's alive, when he's involved, he is fighting this stuff and rejecting this stuff. So let's go next to his inspired translation of the Bible. Let's consider a few examples involving David. The first one's from 1 Kings 3. The Lord communicates with Solomon in a dream. And this is about David, but it's coming as a dream to Solomon. Now, I'm going to show you a few little before and after sections. This comes from my book, The Slow Stain, that I just put out. Actually, that's coming out in a few weeks. When is it? Mid-September. So coming out in a little bit. Currently available on Audible and Kindle for pre-ordering, and then on September 23rd is when it'll be as a paperback listed on Amazon. So this is from a portion of that book where I talk about polygamy. I talk about 24 other things in the book, showing examples of cultural slow stains. But this example, this screenshot I'm going to share with you, comes from the book where we're comparing before and after 1 Kings 3, when Joseph Smith is going through and doing his inspired translations. So on the left, you can see the King James Version says, "And if thou wilt walk in my ways to keep my statutes and my commandments as thy father David did walk, then I will lengthen thy days." That's in our Bible. Joseph Smith took a pen to that and said, he struck out the words, "as thy father David did walk," explicitly pointing out that David did not walk in God's statutes and commandments. And then Joseph adds, "and thou shalt not walk in unrighteousness as did thy father David." Totally 180 flipping the record. The same result happens, by the way, in 2 Samuel 12. And remember, as we get into this, that section 132 claims in a later verse that David's wives and concubines were given unto him of God by the hand of Nathan. That's what it says. David's wives and concubines were given unto him by the hand of Nathan the prophet. Okay, so now let's read 2 Samuel 12. In the King James, it says, "And David said unto Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said unto David, The Lord also hath put away thy sin, thou shalt not die." That seems to support section 132's claim, except Joseph Smith's translation modifies this. And David said unto Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said unto David, the Lord also hath not put away thy sin. Thou shalt not die. Joseph adds just that word, not. The Lord also hath not put away thy sin. You're not justified in doing this. You weren't commanded of God to do this, right? So in the original, Nathan dismisses David's sin. Joseph changes it to the exact opposite. Let's do a final example. This time Solomon. We've done 2 on David. Let's go to Solomon directly. He's not spared the same correction. This change from 1 Kings 11. Let's start with just verse 4. In King James it says, For it came to pass when Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. And so Joseph changes that to say, his heart was not perfect with the Lord, his God, and it became as the heart of David, his father. Solomon is following in David's unrighteous footsteps. His heart isn't becoming, his heart was not perfect, but no, Joseph is he's following in his father's unrighteous footsteps. Let's go to verse 5 and 6. I'll read them together. King James says, For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. And Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and went not fully after the Lord, as did David his father. So then in Joseph's translation, verse 6, it says that Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, as did David his father, and went not fully after the Lord. These are important corrections. And again, they set up a conflict with section 132. Just as Jacob in the Book of Mormon says, these guys were not righteous, David and Solomon, they were doing abominations. But section 132 is I, the Lord, justified David and Solomon. And here's Joseph Smith himself in the Inspired Translation, doubling down on what Jacob in the Book of Mormon says. This is not legitimate. This is not from God. We have all this cultural baggage and inheritance of just assuming, God must have commanded it because it's described in the scriptures. But again, what is described is not prescribed. Just because it says something happens, and even if it says somebody claims that God said it should happen, doesn't necessarily mean that that's entirely true, because people can claim whatever they want to justify whatever they want. But the point is that we have the Book of Mormon and we have Joseph Smith in a modern era, prophet of God, setting the record straight, except section 132 that comes after Joseph's death when he's no longer around says the exact opposite, just as his journal was engineered to say the exact opposite of what he said while he was alive. Okay. Now, I've used the term polygamy. As we've been talking about this, people call it, spiritual wifery or the plurality of wives. It's had many synonyms and related terms that people have called it over the years. But this supposed doctrine is not called any of that. It is called, and this is from section 132, the sole theological basis upon which the church's current doctrine exists. It is called the principle and doctrine of many wives and concubines. Go look it up yourself. Section 132, right at the top. This is the principle and doctrine of many wives and concubines. If you support the idea that section 132 is from God, that Joseph Smith did in fact teach this, that it is an important part of the restored gospel, etc., 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 if you embrace that, you must embrace that this is not just about plural wives, but it's also about concubines, because that is the name of the principle and the doctrine, many wives and concubines. Okay, so concubines. This term appears 4 times in section 132, each of them favorable. It appears 8 times in the Book of Mormon, in each case condemned. So here's an example. 4 of them are in Jacob's sermon that I was referring to earlier, when he's condemning David and Solomon, who truly had many wives and concubines, which thing was abominable before me, saith the Lord. There's 3 uses of the term concubine in the Book of Mormon when describing King Noah and his priests, who did not keep the commandments of God, but he did walk after the desires of his heart, and he had many wives and concubines. The last mention in the Book of Mormon is describing the wicked Jaredite Riplakish, who in Ether 10 says, it says that he did not do that which was right in the sight of the Lord, for he did have many wives and concubines. So in every instance in the Book of Mormon where concubinage is mentioned, or polygamy more broadly, it is described as a whoredom and an abomination and that it's not right in the sight of the Lord, and that it's walking after the desires of your own heart. There's 37 instances in the Old Testament, but in no case is it commanded or described as doctrinal or part of this principle and doctrine of multiple wives and concubines. It's just, this is the cultural context in which these ancient patriarchs and others are living, where societies around them are doing this, but God sees it as a whoredom and abomination. Let's go back to Jacob too. Wherefore, my brethren, hear me and hearken to the word of the Lord. For there shall not any man among you have, save it be one wife, and concubines he shall have none. Very clear. And yet, section 132 claims, Abraham received concubines, and they bore him children, and it was accounted unto him for righteousness, because they were given unto him, and he abode in my law. David also received many wives and concubines, and also Solomon and Moses my servants, and also many others of my servants, from the beginning of creation until this time. And in nothing did they sin, save in those things which they received not of me, when they tried to take, wives and concubines that I didn't give them, but I gave them plenty. And I counted it unto them for righteousness, because they were given unto, I'm sorry, again, we have this fundamental conflict, this wound at the center of church doctrine and history that won't heal, because members of the church are being asked to embrace fundamentally incompatible statements and teachings. And it has to be resolved. Otherwise, it is a wound that won't heal and a darkness that spreads like rust onto everything. It does affect so many other things to require the acceptance of these extremely contradictory things. Jacob reveals that the Lord says this is an abominable. Joseph Smith doubles down, corrects the record, the biblical record. So yeah, these guys are not righteous. And yet section 132 purports otherwise. So a woman living as a concubine was more common in Israel during the patriarchal period of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob than in later periods. And in the ancient Near East, it was acceptable for a married man to have a secondary wife or concubine, so long as he had the resources to support a large family. So apart from working in the home and providing sexual companionship, a major role of the concubine was to produce children to increase, the workforce in the household. And so we see this in the biblical examples where it's just about breeding. It's just about having more children. But these women, these concubines, were sex slaves. I mean, their husbands were their masters. This wasn't a true marital relationship. Concubinage was just we might call it today human trafficking in a sense, right? Where the women had some type of legal claim upon their husband as a concubine, but a lower tier than an actual wife. So they were just there as a possession to be used, much like your possession might have claim on its owner type of thing, but it's just a possession. This is just sex slavery. So they're second status women, not quite a mistress, but not a wife, more of a side piece that culturally has been accepted. I mean, Solomon, the Bible records in 1 Kings that he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Now, again, in the Bible, they would often use these big flourishes of, maybe he just had a few dozen or whatever, but they use these big numbers to say, oh, look how great he is, right? Whatever the number that he had, this was despite God saying in Deuteronomy 17 of the Israelite kings that neither shall he multiply wives to himself. It says, don't multiply horses, don't multiply gold and silver. Basically, don't use your status as an Israelite king to satisfy the lusts of the carnal man, the desires of your heart, gold and silver and horses, military might and power, multiple wives. And yet you look at David, you look at Solomon. Not only is this going against what Joseph Smith said, it's against what what God himself has recorded in Deuteronomy 17 as saying. So anyways, if we accept, which I think is a hard thing to do, but if we accept that 132 is from God and that all the existing scriptures and Joseph Smith's work is just, that's all wrong, because 132, despite its checkered, provenance, which we're about to talk about, despite all that, it's truly from God. Okay, well then, how is concubinage supposed to work in heaven, where there's supposed to be oneness and unity? How can you reconcile it with being sealed to someone? God's commandment that you have, one wife, that you cleave to one another. How do you cleave to someone if you've got this heavenly empire of concubines to be your spiritual sex slaves into the eternities? Again, section 132, this is the doctrine and principle of multiple wives and concubines. You got to reconcile that. Okay, so let's dig into the new stuff, the reveal. let's talk more about this wound at the center of church history and doctrine. I've alluded a couple times to the fact that Section 132 has a checkered provenance, meaning that the claims of its origin, its chain of custody, is very weak. Right? We know that Joseph Smith did the inspired translation of the Bible. We know that Joseph did the translation, if you will, the interpretation or whatever of the Book of Mormon. He wasn't actually translated. He was just writing down what God was revealing, but we say translated, right? We know that Joseph Smith did these things. It is clear. It is indisputable. It is well recorded. You know, we have statements from while Joseph's alive. We have his journal while he's alive, forbidding the practice, excommunicating people. Again and again, the contemporary evidence all shows that Joseph Smith was fighting this, that he wasn't doing it. And yet then we have Section 132 that comes out years later, where Brigham and others are saying, oh, this came from Joseph. So the official narrative is ultimately this comes from the record of Joseph C. Kingsbury. We'll talk about him momentarily. And that is the link in the chain upon which all of Section 132, it's him and William Clayton, as we'll talk about. And so if that link is flawed or fatal or, you know, the whole thing breaks, because it all points to the Kingsbury copy. So our friend, the anesthesiologist Brian Hales, who's an apologist for the church and purports to be a historian on these matters and has a website and books claiming that Joseph Smith was a polygamist and relying on all these completely weak, non-contemporary things to say that Joseph was. It's all bogus. Here's what he says. Some critics contend that at some point the Kingsbury copy was changed, ostensibly by Brigham Young or under his direction. Evidence for this theory is thin. Well, there's new evidence that might thicken up this theory. If we assume that Hales is correct and that the contention that the Kingsbury copy, this link in the chain, is weak or breaking, there's some new evidence that comes from Jeremy Hoop and then Rob Fotheringham. I will link to their videos in the description. But we're going to talk now about what this evidence is. First, let's make sure we're very clear on what the church's official current narrative is for how we have Section 132. So the narrative, the official story, is that this Section 132 was dictated by Joseph Smith to William Clayton on July 12, 1843, in the presence of Hiram Smith. Keep in mind that William Clayton was not a scribe for Joseph's other revelations, right? It's not like William Clayton was like the go-to guy to document all of Joseph's more common mundane revelations, let alone the revelation that completely upended all of the stuff that Joseph had been teaching and doing and saying. The idea that William Clayton would be the person to be in the room and be the scribe for this just earth-shattering, doctrinal, upending revelation when he didn't have that trust and that experience scribing for Joseph with these other revelations. That alone introduces a little question mark, like, why is William Clayton the source of this, the alleged scribe doing this for Joseph Smith? So that's the story, at least, that Joseph, in the presence of Hiram, did this. Clayton writes it down, okay? The story continues that 1 or 2 days later, Newell K. Whitney requests permission to have a copy made. You might remember the name Newell K. Whitney. His was the store in Kirtland where the School of Prophets was held, right? So Whitney asks for permission. Hey, can I make a copy of this? And Joseph Smith's like, yeah, okay, fine. Again, this is the official narrative. Like, this is what the church historians and everyone all rely on to claim that we have Section 132 is coming from Joseph. So Joseph gives it, Clayton writes it, Newell K. Whitney borrows it, and then Newell K. Whitney goes to Joseph C. Kingsbury. Kingsbury is the store clerk, or was in Kirtland, the store clerk for Newell K. Whitney. He's also his brother-in-law. So Kingsbury married Whitney's sister. So they're brothers-in-law. Newell K. Whitney allegedly gets the copy from Clayton with Joseph's permission, takes it to Kingsbury to make a copy. Many decades later, in 1886, here's what Joseph Kingsbury said about this whole affair. Bishop Newell K. Whitney handed me the revelation the day after it was written, or the day following, and stating what it was, asked me to make a copy of it. I did so, and then read my copy of it to Bishop Whitney, who compared it with the original to which he held in his hand while I read to him. When I had finished reading, Bishop Whitney pronounced the copy correct, and Hiram Smith came into the room at the time to fetch the original. Bishop Whitney handed it to him. I will also state that this copy, as also the original, are identically the same as published in the present edition, 1876, of the Book of Doctrine and Covenants. Okay, so that's a decades later statement from Kingsbury describing what happened, that Whitney brings the copy, Kingsbury makes the copy, Newell K. Whitney hands the original, the Clayton version, back to Hiram Smith, who takes it away. And then Kingsbury says, again, decades later, where they've now got it in the 1876 Doctrine and Covenants. It's been public since 3 decades earlier in 1852. We'll talk about that in just a second. So they've got this copy, and Kingsbury says they're all the same. That's very important for what we're about to get into. Kingsbury says, my copy and the original that Clayton did, and what we now have in the Book of Commandments, the Doctrine and Covenants, they're all identical. That's his claim in 1886. Okay. Interestingly, Kingsbury, even though he began his autobiography a few years after this alleged incident took place decades earlier, doesn't even mention it. One would think that if you're involved in something like this, that you're recording it in your autobiography. And yet it wasn't until years and decades later that this story kind of emerges. So that's another little question mark. Why isn't it in Kingsbury's autobiography if, in fact, he's this like centerpiece of this significant, again, doctrinally upchanging, upending revelation? You'd think it would deserve a mention. Question mark. Keep in mind also that Kingsbury is a relative nobody, right? He's not a significant leader in the church. He doesn't have any relevance for why he would be part of the inner circle for something like this. So another little question mark. Clayton's copy, again, back to the official narrative, Clayton's copy was apparently destroyed within weeks of its creation. Let's stick with Clayton for a second. In 1874, again, this is decades later, here's what Clayton said about this whole thing. Towards evening, Bishop Newell K. Whitney asked Joseph if he had any objections to his taking a copy of the Revelation. Joseph replied that he had not, and handed it to him. It was carefully copied the following day by Joseph C. Kingsbury. The copy made by Joseph C. Kingsbury is a true and correct copy of the original in every respect. The copy was carefully preserved by Bishop Whitney. So here's Clayton himself, the alleged source of the initial transcription from Joseph, saying, hey, they're all the same. They're all exact duplicates. It's all a true copy, right? It's also interesting that the church's official narrative and the historians all claim Joseph was being very secretive and this was all on the down low and he was having to use careful language and coded words. And yet he's like, oh yeah, here's this revelation. Newell K. Whitney, you can go, give it to your brother-in-law to make a copy despite like you're not in the inner circle. And like, again, another question mark, like, really? This is, you really think Joseph is doing this when it completely contradicts what he's doing and that he's supposedly doing all this like on the down low? So the claim, right, the official narrative is that Kingsbury's copy was given back to Whitney, who then gave it to Brigham. So Clayton makes a copy, Newell Whitney borrows it, gives it to Kingsbury, and Kingsbury makes a copy. So we've got the Clayton copy and the Kingsbury copy, right? Clayton's copy, allegedly, according to the story, goes back through Hiram Smith, back somewhere, and it gets destroyed. That's the claim. So now we've got the Kingsbury copy, which is given back to Whitney, who asked for the transcription to be made. And then, allegedly, according to the story, Whitney then gives it to Brigham. So here in the August 1852 conference is where Brigham Young announces what had been privately and secretly practiced by him and his buddies. He says, the original copy of this revelation was burnt up. William Clayton was the man who wrote it from the mouth of the prophet. In the meantime, it was in Bishop Whitney's possession. He wished the privilege to copy it, which Brother Joseph granted. Sister Emma burnt the original. This revelation has been in my possession many years, and who has known it? None but those who should know it. I keep a patent lock on my desk, and there does not anything leak out that should not. Okay, so again, this is the official story, which we're going to poke at with a new bit of evidence that thickens the evidence, to use Brian Hale's analogy. Again, Clayton to Whitney to Kingsbury, so Kingsbury makes a copy. Kingsbury gives it back to Whitney, who gives it to Brigham Young, who announces it in 1852 and says, I've had it in my desk all along, magically hiding there secretly that none of you knew about. But lo and behold, this revelation from Joseph Smith in 1852, years after his martyrdom. again, the official narrative, and we'll wrap up with the official narrative, is that Willard Richards made a copy of the Kingsbury copy, supposedly in 1846. So this is years prior to the 1852 revelation, right? At that time, Richards is in the first presidency. He's second counselor to Brigham Young. In the early days, while Joseph is alive, Richards is Joseph's scribe. He's an apostle. He's a church historian and recorder. He, the one, by the way, is who's keeping Joseph's journal and records while Joseph is alive. Joseph forbids the practice of, polygamy, forbids marrying, wants to try, prosecute, excommunicate those who are doing it. And then he edits it after Joseph's death. All of this is happening, by the way, while Willard Richards has secretly taken on a polygamous wife while he's recording in Joseph's journal. Joseph forbids the practice. So he's part of this insider group that does this. And it was in January 1843 that he polygamously married a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old set of sisters, before then recording in Joseph's journal. And anyway, so he's part of this, right, from 1843, but in years following. So the official narrative is he gets the Kingsbury copy and he makes a copy itself. Again, official story. Clayton over to Kingsbury's copy, and now Kingsbury's copy over to Richard's copy. That is the official narrative. Okay? So it's important to note here that Richards made a copy of the Kingsbury, which was a copy of the Clayton. So Clayton to Kingsbury to Richards. This is the official story. This would mean that the Richards copy would exactly match the Kingsbury copy, that the Kingsbury copy was the source of truth used by Brigham and others in 1852 when they announced it, and then 2 decades later when they put it into the Doctrine and Covenants, that the Kingsbury copy was the source of truth because they no longer had the Clayton copy. Brigham claimed that Emma burnt it up, right? That's the claim. So the Kingsbury copy is the source of truth, where Kingsbury and Clayton, they're all saying years later, oh, they're all the same. All these versions are the same. And then Richards makes a copy from Kingsbury. So Richards would have to be the same as well, because the Kingsbury is the source of truth. This is why Brian Hales said, oh, there's claims about the Kingsbury, being made up or being altered or edited. Evidence for this is thin. So, okay, let's thicken that up. I owe what I'm about to share to, as I said earlier, Jeremy Hoop, was still Mormon, who discovered this along with Rob Fotheringham. I will link in the description to both their videos on this that came out last week. Jeremy's is quite long. It's a recording of an event where he and others were talking about this. And so you can watch that for a longer one. Rob's is a much shorter one. It's 18 minutes, and it's just condensed, focused on what I'm about to share. I'm only going to share a little bit of what you can go find more detail about in those videos if you're curious. So again, you can find those in the comments. So I'm just wanting to introduce you to this idea and thicken the evidence a little bit in the context of Section 132 and Latter-day Concubines being supposedly part of our, doctrine. It appears from this new evidence that these guys have encountered that the Richards document may have been created before the Kingsbury document. So again, the official narrative is that Clayton made it, then Kingsbury made a copy, and then Richards made a copy. Therefore, the Richards copy came after the Kingsbury copy. The Kingsbury copy is the source of truth. That's what Brigham reads in 1852. This is the official narrative. And yet, this new evidence that these guys found suggests that the Kingsbury copy came after Richards. Now, you might wonder, why is that significant? Who cares? We're going to get into this. A few notes first. So, as I said, Joseph's journal does say of this date, this alleged date of the revelation, his journal notes, received a revelation in the office and presence of Hiram and William Clayton. Now, that does not say what it is. That also could have been, written later. This isn't a contemporary journal. Richards was doing a memo book to do history. He's taking notes to construct a history. So it's not truly a contemporary record. So we don't even know if that was recorded the day of. But even if it was, it doesn't say what was in the revelation. And there's reason to believe, I think, that what was received that day or shared that day, what was shared before the High Council, and what Joseph Smith did have was some type of revelation around sealing, right? But it was altered and added to and amended to turn it into this polygamous construction. Clayton's journal, William Clayton's journal, which again is suspect, it's not contemporary. You can see my past musing, why are William Clayton's journals hidden? You can go to sundaymusings.org, just type Clayton, and you'll find that if you haven't seen that one and want to get into why William Clayton's journals are a little problematic. So his journal, quote unquote, says, "This morning I wrote a revelation consisting of 10 pages on the order of the priesthood, showing the designs in Moses, Abraham, and Solomon, having many wives and concubines, etc. After it was wrote, Presidents Joseph and Hiram presented it and read it to Emma, who said she did not believe a word of it and appeared very rebellious." Now, again, there are a lot of reasons to suspect this is not contemporary. It was written later to construct a narrative. Go see that other musing if you're interested in that. And there's other reasons, other little question marks, why 132, section 132 is suspect. Like, if Brigham Young had this revelation, I would think it's rational to conclude that he would have used it in the succession crisis to bolster his position. But he didn't. The High Council meeting, August 12th, 1843, where it's alleged that this revelation on plural wives and concubines was read. That's what Clayton says. It's what others say. That High Council meeting the notes list that William Marks was teaching with Hiram Smith on the date in question. But later, William Marks said that the first time he ever heard about this purported revelation was a year later. So that date of the High Council, what we have from the notes is these guys are teaching something. Yes, Hiram Smith and William Marks, he's the stake president, I think, at the time. They're teaching something. Doesn't say what. Other people infer that, oh, they're teaching polygamy. And yet Marks later testifies that the first time he hears about it was a year after this. So that creates an interesting question. The entire thing about Section 132 rests on William Clayton, who's especially, I think, extremely suspicious and adulterous. Again, you can go see that other musing if you're interested in digging into William Clayton a little bit. So again, that link, the chain, it's Kingsbury and it's Clayton. And there's reasons to believe that both of these links are just totally wrong and corrupt and false. And so the whole thing rests on the links to these guys. The Kingsbury copy, which is alleged to have been the source of truth from Clayton, and then Clayton himself, who again had never scribed for anything like this, and who, while on his mission, was abandoning his family. And I think we can infer from his journals and what he was scribbling out and washing of the feet and all this stuff that I talk about in that other musing, was engaged in adultery and had these desires of his own heart, as we just read earlier from the book of Mormon and the Bible, that these guys were lusting and trying to justify it. And again, we know that Joseph's journal was edited after he died to reverse what Joseph was teaching on marriage. Okay, so let's then go to this Richards document. We've talked about Kingsbury, and the official narrative is that the Richards document was a copy of Kingsbury. And what Jeremy and Rob and these guys have found by analyzing the Richards document is that there's a lot of reasons to think that the Richards document was not actually a copy of the Kingsbury, but in fact things may have been reversed. So here is an image of the Richards document, the beginning of the transcribed revelation. The claim, again, it's a copy of Kingsbury's, a true and correct copy of the original. This would mean that Richard's copy would have no edits. It would simply be a replica. Like, you might make a little typo here and there, perhaps, but like it would be a clean copy of the original, a true copy, as was being said, right? Except that there are several edits to the Richards document. Jeremy and these guys list 12, I believe. Again, you can go see those videos for more details. I'm just going to share 3. One, for example, is that in the Richards document, as you could see in the image that I shared, it wrote down that the date of this alleged revelation was July 10th, 1843. Whereas in the Kingsbury copy, it says July 12th. Well, if Richards is just copying, why would he not write July 12th? Why would he write July 10th? And oh, by the way, why would he then later edit, as you can see in the pencil, with a question mark and then write the 12th? Like, hey, maybe I think it's actually the 12th. That again, big question mark should come up for us. If the Richards is just a copy of the source of truth, the Kingsbury copy, why wouldn't he just write July 12th? Why would he write 10th and then, oh, later, hey, maybe it was the 12th? That alone introduces a question mark. Another example from the Richards document, it says, I gave unto my servant Joseph an appointment to restore all things. But in the Kingsbury copy, there's some additional words. I gave unto thee, my servant Joseph, an appointment and restore all things. And the word to is omitted. So multiple different words just in that sentence alone. Hard to think that if this was just a scribe doing this, being able to check against the original, he's a historian, he's a scribe, he's really good at this. He's not just quickly trying to take notes on something. He's like, this is his job. It's hard to think that in a single sentence there would be 3 alterations if all you're doing is making a true and faithful copy of an original. Another question mark. Final example I'll share. I, the Lord, will bless her. That's what the Richards copy says. I, the Lord, will bless her. But in Kingsbury it says, I, the Lord, thy God, will bless her. And so in the Richards document, what you see is edits where, in this case, the words thy God are included into Richards, right? And that is what the Kingsbury copy has. So this itself already is saying, well, wait a minute. If the Richards copy comes from Kingsbury, then why does the Richards copy have this original that, by the way, reads coherently? It's not like he made these edits and like, oh, that doesn't sound right. Did I miss a word from the Kingsbury? Oh, yeah, I missed a word. Let me do it. If you read the Richards copy, the original before all these edits, it flows. It reads well. These edits weren't needed, right? Only to make them consistent with what then became the Kingsbury version. So it appears that the Richards document preceded the Kingsbury document, that it was edited, and all those edits, by the way, are consistent with the Kingsbury version. So it appears that Richards has a document, and then he's going through as an editor. He's like, well, it would sound better this way. Let me change this. Oh, actually, the date from our research is, because look, we put into Joseph's journal that on, Clayton made the journal, and he said on July 12th is when this happened. So let's edit this out and put July 12th. Like, this has the appearance of going through an evolutionary process of editing. And then once those edits are done, we get the Kingsbury copy, which has all of these edits that Richards was making. Do you see what I'm saying? So if the official narrative is that Richards just copied Kingsbury, we wouldn't have any of this. And yet Richards has all these edits, and lo and behold, they're all in the Kingsbury copy, which suggests, I think, the reasonable conclusion, it would appear, that Richards was doing all this editing and that the Kingsbury copy came later. This alone upends the narrative of how we got section 132. And we know, by the way, that Richards' document was edited not only from the annotations and the actual edits, but because the Richards document says as much. This is what Jeremy and Rob and these guys found on the back of the Richards document. Here is an image of what is written. It's actually sideways, so I've turned it 90 degrees. I've actually also darkened this up. You can see in the original, which is in the Church History Library's online catalog, you can see it just fine without this darkening. I just made it a little dark so the pencil is just slightly more clear to be able to see. What does it say? EX period as altered in pencil, August 7th, 52. That's 1852. Again, at this time, Richards is second counselor in the first presidency to Brigham Young. This editor is likely Richards himself. And what is this EX? Well, EX means exemplar or a copy. So in the 19th century, editors would write EX or exemplar on a document to indicate that it was an example or a specimen copy. So like the official version or a reference version that would then be used for comparison and as a model for further copies. Like, hey, this is the official edit, the final draft. So use this to make additional copies. That's what EX meant in an editorial context. This practice, this EX was common in publishing and editorial work, where it was important to maintain a clear record for like an authoritative version of a document that was essential for accuracy and consistency. So marking a document EX signaled that it was the approved version against which other copies should be checked, right? This was like the final draft. This was, especially important in the era before digital duplication, when there would be multiple handwritten copies and printed copies that could introduce errors or variations. And so the exemplar served as the standard for correctness in the editorial process. That's critical to understand. Why? Because the official narrative is that Kingsbury's copy was the exemplar. His was the copy from Clayton that, Emma burnt the original, and we have this Kingsbury copy, despite Kingsbury being the random brother-in-law of the random store owner that Neither of these guys were in Joseph's inner circle, but thankfully we have the Kingsbury copy who gave it to Newell K. Whitney, who locked it in the desk. Brigham Young locked it in his desk, and at some point Richards makes a copy from using Kingsbury as the exemplar or the standard for correctness. That is the narrative. Except Richards himself, in the First Presidency, the church historian, this guy that was involved in altering Joseph's journal and all this kind of stuff, revising with Brigham the history of the church, right? Richards says, here's this copy, August 7th, 1852, that now is the exemplar, the standard for correctness, the standard that should be used for making additional copies. Now, that date is important, August 7th, 1852. That's what he writes of when he's doing these edits. That's important because Brigham publicizes this revelation just weeks later on August 28 at a special conference. So the editor, Richards, was modifying this just 3 weeks prior. Brigham claims that it's been locked away in his desk, that no one's got access, lock and key, it's been here, came from Newell K. Whitney, and then it was in my desk, and here it is, we're going to read it. When Richards, the church historian and Brigham's counselor in the First Presidency, just 3 weeks prior, himself is making annotations and changes that would then match exactly with the Kingsbury copy that later came out, right, that was purported to be from years prior, but Kingsbury's appears to be a copy, a nice clean copy from Richard's document, who was editing and tweaking, and then on the back saying, this is the exemplar. We've got 3 weeks to go until this special conference that Brigham has called, and so let's make sure that we get this locked down. Let's then go have Kingsbury create a copy in his handwriting. This is what it would appear happen, and that is what is read in this special conference. Now, 2 weeks after the 1852 conference, the Deseret News publishes the purported revelation because Brigham and his buddies have just read it. They explained, Brigham did, that it was trapped in his desk. Elder Thomas Bullock stands up to read it at Brigham's direction. One would assume then that what Bullock reads over the pulpit was the Kingsbury copy in Whitney's possession and then Brigham's possession, ostensibly preserved by Brigham Young, right? So Bullock should just be reading this original, which Clayton and Kingsbury years later all say, these are all exact, these are all the same. Everything is the same. The Doctrine and Covenants version, the Kingsbury version, Clayton's version, they're all saying this is all the exact same. You know, Kingsbury again in 1886, he said, this copy, as also the original, are identically the same as published in the present edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. A few years before that, 1870, he similarly said that what was published in the Deseret News in September of 1852 is a true copy of the original. So Kingsbury's like, yep, it all checks out. What the Deseret News published, what's in the Doctrine and Covenants, what's in the copy that I made that I gave to Whitney, that Whitney gave to Brigham Young, all these are just totally the same. So he's saying that Kingsbury, that his copy is the same as the Deseret News copy, which is the same as the Doctrine and Covenants copy. Except there are a lot of differences between the Deseret News copy and the Kingsbury copy. I'll just throw this up on the screen and you can read all three together. And there's others. Again, you can go to those other guys' videos and see more. Kingsbury's says, verily, thus saith the Lord unto you, my servant Joseph. Deseret News changes it unto his servant Joseph. Changes the first person to the third person, whatever, all that. I'm not good at English, right? Whatever those are called. Whosoever sins you retain on earth is changed from the Deseret News, whatsoever sins. And there's a bunch of these, right? So again, there's just a little example. So we've got all these guys saying, nothing to see here. All of our copies are the same. Kingsbury's like, it's the same as the Deseret News, except it isn't. And, Richards made a copy from mine. Oh, no, he didn't. And the Doctrine and Covenants version is the same, right? Except like the Richards copy and all the edits he makes is what becomes apparently the Kingsbury copy, which is what becomes the Doctrine and Covenants version. Okay, let's pause and let's talk about what is needed here by way of going back to Brian Hales, the thin evidence, or now the thicker evidence. What's actually needed? Let's imagine we're in a courtroom. I did a musing on polygamy on the past about Joseph Smith. Anyways, I don't remember what the title was. Go to sundaymusings.org, search for polygamy, you'll find it. It was, I think it was called Joseph Smith Criminal, where I showed all these examples where we believe Latter-day Saints, the church, its position is that we believe Joseph was innocent of all of these horrible criminal charges that people were throwing at him. And again and again and again, he was innocent and he was able to get out of court and there was no evidence and his enemies were making claims against him and these affidavits that were just flagrantly false. And we cheer all that on, right? Yay, Joseph Smith was innocent of all these allegations made against him. And yet those same church members then listen to Joseph Smith's enemies and these flagrantly false affidavits years and decades later, et cetera, to build a case and agree with the case that Joseph Smith was guilty of polygamy, despite him asserting his innocence throughout his life, fighting it, clarifying in his inspired translation that it's doctrinally false, that it's a whoredom, that's an abomination. Despite all of that, these same church... Anyway, so in that musing, I get into that from a kind of a criminal law context. I want to briefly bring that up here because I don't have to prove anything regarding Section 132. I don't have to... I've offered a few suggestions, right? That, okay, Richards was making all these edits and then Kingsbury created a copy that they claimed was written years prior, but it's just using the exemplar, the standard version from Richards where he's like, okay, we've got the final product. We figured out it's not July 10th, it's July 12th to be consistent with Clayton's reverse engineered journal. Like, I've speculated a little bit, but I don't have to prove anything. If there's these allegations that Section 132 came from, Clayton to Kingsbury, to Richards, Brigham Young, Doctrine and Covenants, Deseret News, this is the official narrative. The prosecution, so-called, has asserted something as being true. All I feel I have to do, if we're kind of pretending we're in criminal court, that there's an allegation being made, an allegation that Joseph Smith created this revelation and all these guys, this is the chain of custody. All I have to do is show reasonable doubt in the prosecutor's claims, right? The prosecution's job is to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this is true. The church's official narrative requires them to show that it's beyond reasonable doubt. Now, of course, you get all the historians who are all kind of, we agree, and we only accept what the church's official position is, and we give credibility to all of Joseph's enemies and all these affidavits decades later, and we don't look at any of the other, right? So some people on social media will push back, but all the historians agree. I'm like, they all agreed on COVID. They all agree on man-made global warming. They all, like 99% of them. Like, I'm sorry, right? Just because there's this supposed consensus from the professorial credentialed class doesn't really hold much water with me. I think, we've gone over a lot of these little question marks. I think there's lots of reasons for doubt here. Those links in the chain, the Kingsbury, the Clayton, I think there's a lot of reason to doubt, especially now with what Jeremy and these guys have found of Richards on the back saying this is an exemplar copy, that he's editing it days prior, and that, oh, by the way, just days later, all of his edits get into the Kingsbury copy that was alleged to have been locked away in Brigham's desk. Right? So there's the prosecution, like as you would in a criminal court. Prosecution saying, well, I think this guy murdered him, and I think he drove here, and then he went here, and then, he pulled money out of the ATM, and he bought a gun, and then the prosecution will have a narrative, and all the defense has to do is undermine one little link in that chain. If the defendant has an alibi, right, and the prosecution is claiming, oh, he went here on this day at this time, and if the defendant has an alibi showing that he wasn't there at that time, he was over here, the narrative crumbles, and the prosecution's ability to convict withers away unless they can come up with some other new narrative. I think there's a lot of reason for doubt here, that we can't convict Joseph of being the source of this revelation. We can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the official narrative of how we got Section 132 is legitimate. A section, by the way, that compels us to believe in the doctrine of multiple wives and concubines, which the rest of Scripture that we got through Joseph is all called whoredoms and abominations, right? Like all these problems. But the official narrative, I think, may be totally wrong. It may be that Kingsbury's document was a later creation, which would upend the narrative of how it came to existence, which suggests that it was a manufactured product after Joseph's death by people who were revising history, reversing what Joseph Smith had done and taught, and backfilling a narrative to offer theological support to their polygamous whoredoms and abominations. I mean, we can, as a defense attorney might do, you could ask questions that would sow doubt in the jury's minds. If Brigham Young had 132, the section, what later became section 132, but if he had this revelation locked in his desk for years, why are there so many versions? Why is Richards editing days prior to the release of this revelation, and all of those edits magically become what was supposedly locked away in Brigham's desk from Kingsbury? Right? Like, why are there so many variations between the documents and the Deseret News version, where Kingsbury claimed these are all the same, there's no edits? Why would Richards, if copying an original, get the date wrong at the very beginning, and then in two series of edits, one in pencil and then one what appears to be in ink, writes, oh no, it's the 12th? Question mark 12th? Is it really, like, why would that happen if this is a true and faithful copy? The question means it's an edit, not an error. That he's like, I need to look into this. We need to figure this out, right? So again, in the description, if you want to get more into these, you can go look at Jeremy's video, which is longer. You can look at Rob's, which is shorter. I just want to introduce this a little bit in the broader context of, are you kidding me? Latter-day concubines. And by the way, we have this wound at the center of church history and doctrine that has to be reconciled. Otherwise, it's just this open wound, this darkness spreading like rust. It is, a problem. It implicates succession. It implicates Brigham Young. It implicates the keys. It implicates what we understand about ourselves. It implicates church historians and their credibility. It implicates all these things. And it's very easy to dismiss all of this. I'll give you a very specific example as we wrap. It's very easy to dismiss all of this. Let me share a particular example. So I came across someone's post on X just a few days ago. And this person posted, "Story time. We knocked a door on my mission. The guy answered the door and said, 'Yeah, I can't believe in Joseph Smith since he had multiple wives.' My trainee jumped in and said, 'That's a common misconception. Joseph was only married to Emma. Polygamy was introduced by Brigham Young.' I bit my tongue and gently corrected him after we left the house. 'Sorry, Elder, but Joseph Smith was definitely a polygamist.' He was completely surprised. 'How do you know?' And then this guy replies, 'Well, for starters, he married my great-grand-aunt.' Ha 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 emoji. This gentleman then posted his family tree showing his connection to his great-grand-aunt Desdemona Fulmer, who he claims, this gentleman, was married to Joseph Smith in just a matter-of-fact way, right? Oh, we know that Joseph Smith was polygamy because, for starters, he married my great-grand-aunt. So I replied, and I said, 'Your great-grand-aunt left no journal or reminiscence of her own, let alone any documentation or evidence to speak of. She signed an affidavit written by Joseph F. Smith 26 years later without specifying a date of the alleged nuptials, saying not that she was married to Joseph, but that she was, quote, married or sealed.' She wasn't married," I said. She may have been sealed. There is zero evidence of any marital relationship." Here is an image of the affidavit that Joseph F. Smith put together. So that's my reply, saying you're just claiming, dismissing the other position that Joseph Smith may not have been a polygamist. You're just claiming, well, of course, because they were married, right? So I'm pointing out that there's no evidence, there's no contemporary documentation, no nothing, just this affidavit years later that she didn't even write. Joseph F. Smith was going around and writing all these and just giving it to the women, many of whom didn't even sign it. And it doesn't say we were married or that we engaged in temporal, carnal, anything. It just says we were married or sealed, completely leaving this loophole for spiritual sealings, but making everyone think that these are all polygamous temporal marriage. This gentleman then replied. He says, "My first and perhaps only post about Joseph Smith's polygamy controversy. There is, capital letters, abundant evidence that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, including many contemporaneous first-hand accounts. You are hard-pressed to find any credentialed professional historian who has examined the evidence and concluded otherwise. This is why the church has included it as fact in the Saints volumes, the Gospel Topics essays, which our friend Brian Hales was part of constructing, family history records, and other publications. Even Community of Christ historians, who for decades insisted polygamy was a Brigham Young invention, eventually acknowledged that the evidence of Joseph's polygamy was too strong to dismiss. While it's true some sealings seemed purely dynastic, connecting families, many were actually marital in nature. Connor insists below that while Joseph and Desdemona Fulmer may have been sealed, there is, quote, zero evidence that this potential sealing was a marriage, polygamy. And yet we have the diary of William Clayton, the affidavit Connor himself linked, which repeatedly uses the word marriage to describe the sealing, and most importantly, the testimony of Desdemona Fulmer herself in her own autobiographical accounts below. So he's relying, again, these links, he's relying on Clayton, the diary of William Clayton, he says, the affidavit that was written decades later that doesn't just say marriage, it says married or sealed. And he says, most importantly, the testimony of Desdemona Fulmer herself in her own autobiographical accounts. And for that, he posts a screenshot from Brian Hale's website, a little biographical sketch of Desdemona Fulmer. Here is just the top portion thereof. I'm going to read the third paragraph. It says, she gave this brief account. Having been convinced of the truth of polygamy, I therefore entered into the order, but I dared not make it known, not even to my parents, for I was forbidden by the prophet, for it would endanger the life of Joseph and also many of the saints. Previous paragraph, it says, Desdemona Fulmer married Joseph Smith in July 1843. Okay, so this is, according to this gentleman, whose name and user I blurred because it's not about the individual, it's about the idea, so I don't want to get distracted with sending you all to, go post on this guy's thing. But he says, most importantly, the testimony of Desdemona Fulmer herself in her own autobiographical account, for which we get below, where she says, I therefore entered into the order. By the way, interestingly, she doesn't say, I married Joseph Smith. She just says, I entered into the order in this abstract sense. And yet, if you look at the footnote on Brian Hale's own website, here it is. The highlighted portion reads, the exact source of this quotation is unknown. Church historians have been unable to locate it in the archives. When contacted by Don Bradley in 2008, Quinn, this historian, was unable to recall additional details, but was confident of the accuracy of the document. So here's this guy saying the diary of William Clayton, which, I replied in another reply. I'm like, it's not a true diary. This is a later creation. So you can't rely upon that as a contemporary document. The affidavit, later creation, decades later. There's loopholes, married or sealed, blah, 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 right? Not contemporary, not valid. And most importantly, the testimony of Desdemona Fulmer herself in her own autobiographical accounts. Oh, and by the way, we can't find any source for this at all. There's no documentation. The exact source is unknown. So I don't think this issue is going away. And I think that the credentialed historians and church leaders and many church members are going to have to try and address this wound at the center of church history and culture and doctrine. We have to. Because we have Section 132 that makes these claims about polygamous prophets of the past. And yet Joseph Smith himself and in the Book of Mormon are saying, this is not the case. And the Bible itself not describing any of this as polygamy. We have Section 132 saying, I, the Lord, gave David and Solomon these things, and in nothing did they sin. No. Book of Mormon is like, this is whoredom, this is abomination. Concubinage is sex slavery. This is all totally wrong. And yet we have William Clayton, Joseph Kingsbury, and Section 132. The chain of custody of which, as we've highlighted, is so weak. Again, I don't have to say what happened. I don't have to say precisely where all this stuff emerged and who did what and when. I just have to point out holes, flaws in these links, that these links are broken, that they're corrupt, that they're failing. I mean, think about this. There are women who, for years, claimed that they had borne Joseph Smith's children. Right? This was a claim advanced by some of these women. Oh, my daughter over here, my son, whatever, that's Joseph Smith's child. I was his polygamous wife. And that was their narrative about a living child. This is Joseph's child. We now know that they lied. Right? DNA evidence has disproved all of these claims. And yet these women insisted. that I was Joseph's wife and that is Joseph's child. Like, you think you would know, right? Think I engaged in intercourse and got pregnant, and this is the child resulting from that consummation of our polygamous marriage. Like, it's not hard to know whether that's true or false if you yourself are involved. So these women advance this narrative. By the way, turns out they lied. Question is why. So people are like, oh, but, you know, to say Joseph was a liar means that all these women in the affidavits and everything would have to have. Okay, well, these other women who claimed that they had borne Joseph's children, we know so we know that there were women lying. The question is why, and we could get into all kinds of reasons, right? I replied to this in the guy on X. It's like, you know, they were trying to justify this from a theological standpoint, pushing against the RLDS claims, right? So there was this war between Joseph, the cousins, right, and the Smith family. And so the Brigham had to reverse engineer this, had to defend themselves, say this all came from Joseph. You've got the conflict with the federal government cracking down on this, and they have to show this is part of our religion. It came from Joseph Smith. You've got the spiritual street cred that you get in this environment. If you claim that you were one of Joseph's wives, there's swagger, there's SWAT. If you can kind of say, yeah, you know, like, so there's all these women. We know some of them regarding their children lied. It's not far-fetched to say that others were lying too. So what is the end goal? What is the end goal if we disprove the validity of section 132? Again, like, that's not to say every single verse in there is wrong. It could very well have been. Again, I'm not trying to prove anything here. I'm just trying to disprove a particular claim and narrative, or at least show why there's evidence to doubt it, right? And so I don't know. I don't know what happened. One speculation is that Joseph, in fact, did receive a revelation, that they, in fact, did read it to the High Council, that revelation was about, let's say, sealings to our, like, eternal families, right? And we can be sealed to our loved ones. Like, it could have been about something like that that's contained within 132, but then 132 was amended and expanded and whatever, right, to put all this other junk in there. So it's not like they wrote the entire thing, perhaps. It could be that we got something from Joseph and they just altered it. Just like his journal said, I forbid the practice of polygamy and try those who are doing it. And then that was altered. So, you know, if the church came out and said, oops, we made a mistake, and then removed section 132, then what? You know, like, again, I'm not saying here what did happen. I'm not saying what ought to be done. I just think it's important for us to address that there is a wound at the center of our church galaxy, that we are compelled to believe in if we accept 132, which is canonized and official church doctrine, that it is the doctrine of multiple wives and concubines, that is alleged to have come from God, not just multiple wives, but concubines as well. And all of these things that we can't reconcile, either Joseph's a liar or Brigham's a liar. Either the Book of Mormon has some sort of loopholes that Jacob wasn't talking about, and either Joseph Smith was wrong in his inspired translation, or this is from God, where God says, yep, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and David and Solomon. Like, we've got this wound, and it's not going away. And all the church historians polishing all the official narratives, ignoring all of these inconvenient things that they won't engage with, I think is not going to resolve the problem. It's not going to heal the wound, and people are going to keep talking about it. And this isn't going away. I think, as I've said in the past, more transparency, more discussion, more engaging with this material, less credibility in Joseph's enemies and claims decades later, more trust in Joseph's own words and actions while he's alive, fighting all this off, trying to put it down. It's like mind-boggling to me that people who revere Joseph as a prophet then implicitly assume he's a liar and he was going around marrying teenage girls and other men's wives and all this stuff. And I'm like, how do you reconcile that? No wonder ex-Mormons attack the church for Joseph Smith being a sleazeball. No wonder people in the church have faith crises when they learn this stuff, because they're compelled to accept Joseph as this just deceitful philanderer when he wasn't. That these accusations during his life were just going all over the place. And he's like, everyone claims I'm married to 7 wives, and I look around and I can only find one. And all these women claiming that I fathered their children. He didn't say this. This was after his death. Oh, this is Joseph's child. And yet, you know, he only fathered children with Emma. DNA evidence has now proven this. He was very fertile. They had a lot of kids. If Joseph's sleeping around with all these women, there would have been actual kids. There's none. These women lied. The chain of custody of this purported revelation has holes in it now. Richards is editing it days prior to it being released, even though Brigham says it's been locked in his desk. Something smells. And I'd rather see the wound healed. Let's get it out, get some sunlight, air it out. Let's let it scab over. Let's move on from this. But if we're required to believe that Joseph Smith was a liar, if we're required to believe that all these biblical patriarchs were polygamously approved by God in doing it, when the Book of Mormon itself says the opposite, when Joseph Smith's inspired translation of the Bible says the opposite, that is a wound that's not going to heal if Latter-day Saints are compelled to reconcile completely contradictory things. Tell me your thoughts. I'm going to leave this topic alone for a while. I've done now a few of these on polygamy. I got a long list of other topics I want to cover, but given President Oakes's recent statement on Heavenly Mothers and the dust that kicked up in social media, and this new revelation discovery from Jeremy and these guys, I thought it was worth surfacing this and just raising this idea of latter-day concubinage being, in my mind, just such a weird thing. And the fact that we don't even acknowledge that shows this selective interpretation of scripture, just like with the word of wisdom and all these other things. The fact that no one calls it the doctrine of multiple wives and concubines, even though that's what the scripture says. It's like we just sidestep that. That part's gross, so let's just not pay attention to that. And so I want the wound to heal. I would love for us to move on and be able to reconcile this. And now the prosecution's narrative is undermined a little bit. And we'll see what happens from here. Maybe the the church in this case, will come up with a new narrative. Maybe there will be an amended thing, and who knows? Again, I'm not claiming this is what happened, but there's enough question marks here where the official narrative, I think, has reasonable doubt, and frankly, a lot of it. Tell me what you think in the comments. Hope you guys have a great week, and I'll see you next week.